Two human rights organisations have written to the policing board calling for it to hold an inquiry following alleged police surveillance of journalists. Recently, an investigatory powers tribunal hearing in London showed that a PSNI spying operation involved up to 8 journalists working in Northern Ireland. A number of solicitors were also under surveillance. Shortly, you'll hear from one of those journalists, Trevor Burney, along with Patrick Corrigan from Amnesty International and the Alliance member of the policing board, Nuala McAllister. But first, this report from Tori Watson.
Arrested for doing their job. In 2018, journalists Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey were detained by police. The action resulting from a joint operation led by Durham Police and supported by the PSNI. The journalists were questioned about information they had obtained for an investigative documentary about the UVF Loughin Island massacre. A number of items were also seized from their homes and offices. Both men were released, and the following year they successfully won a court case. It found the search warrants used had been inappropriate and that journalists had acted properly and protected their sources in a lawful way. The result, an almost £900,000 damages payout by the PSNI. The journalists then filed a case with the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, a body which examines complaints relating to covert surveillance. Little did they know, they would uncover further allegations of much wider intrusion. Documents disclosed at court revealed routine police checks of the phone records of up to 8 journalists.
It has now emerged that there was surveillance on those 2 journalists, but they weren't the only ones, that this was happening in a much more widespread way, and there was industrial harvesting, if you like, of phone data from journalists. This was not a targeted operation, it's clear. It was not against a particular journalist where they were worried that somebody was talking to them and there was an issue of national security. This was a mass intercept of journalistic communications, and we're being told by some of those who have seen this that was based on people who were seen as troublemaker journalists. Well, clearly there is no legal justification for that being the way in which the police are in any way allowed to interact with journalists' private communications.
How damaging is this for the PSNI?
This is massively damaging for the police because they were set up as the PSNI to prevent this stuff happening. There were concerns about Special Branch, there were concerns about how the RUC ran informers. Intelligence was a massive part of the new police force. And here you have the suggestion that those rules have been completely ineffective.
The Chief Constable met with the leadership of the policing board to discuss this issue last week. At that meeting, John Boucher told the board that it could expect a report on the extent of surveillance of legal professionals and journalists carried out by the PSNI at its next meeting in June. In a statement to View from Stormont, the PSNI said the Chief Constable continues to cooperate with the Investigatory Powers Tribunal and the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office. As legal proceedings are ongoing, it would be inappropriate to comment. While many questions remain unanswered, the journalists at the centre of this scandal remain steadfast in their search for truth.
Tori Watson reporting. Listening to that, the journalist and filmmaker Trevor Burney, the Alliance MLA Nuala McAllister, who sits on the policing board, and the head of nations and regions at Amnesty International UK, Patrick Corrigan. Trevor Burney, to start with you, this has been a long journey. How shocked are you at the figures which have been revealed?
I think every time we go to London for a hearing, Paul, it seems that new information comes out, and it is quite shocking. I think it is. It's one of those things, if you're a journalist working in Northern Ireland, you always had this thing at the back of your mind, would the police ever be listening to our calls? Would the police be interested in what's going on in our lives? And I think we all lived with that paranoia, if you like, that the police were. But certainly what we're seeing coming out of the IPT in London confirms that there was an obsessive interest in journalists and their sources at the PSNI. What we don't know, Paul, is where that comes from. We had Alan McQuillan, the former Assistant Chief Constable, give an interview to the Belfast Telegraph last week talking about this.
He said out of control, running amok, and he suspected that they were acting outside the law.
Well, it does. And I think the questions that Alan McQuillan throws up as well, he says he didn't know about it, but he was Assistant Chief Constable. So who does know about it? Who did know about this programme? And can they be held accountable? I think that's the interesting thing. And I think that's ultimately what we want the IPT and the policing board to do.
Patrick, what do police need to do in order to tap a phone?
Well, I mean, in this day and age of technology, they're not really tapping phones so much as accessing the phone data. And all of the cases we know about so far through the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, including Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey's case, is they were accessing the phone data, so their call records, incoming calls, outgoing calls, but also their text messaging in and outgoing. And that meant they were going after potentially confidential sources of these journalists. In order to do that lawfully, and there are lawful routes to do that, normally the police should bring forward what's called a production order, bring that before a judge in a court of law, and the journalists can make their argument in defence, the police can make their arguments, and the judge decides. In this case, the police have bypassed this process, and one police officer has requested of another police officer the authorisation to go after the journalist's phone data. That's been rubber stamped, and that is what has become the custom and practice, it seems, within the PSNI, totally outside what we understand to be the normal rule of law.
Nuala McAllister, the police service in Northern Ireland is to publish a report in June on the extent of its surveillance of journalists and lawyers. What do you expect?
Well, one thing that I do expect in the upcoming Policing Board meeting in June is that we need to put an end to this drip feed of information, and to which not only the Policing Board but the journalists have also been provided with. I think it is of great concern to me as a Policing Board member and also as a political representative. You know, the freedom that is provided to the press, both nationally and internationally, must be upheld, and so we will be continuing to engage with the Chief Constable. I do believe that the Chief Constable is taking this matter seriously, but I have said from the start that if we fail to receive the information that we need to get through the Policing Board, then we need to look at the powers of which we do have to ensure that we have that accountability mechanism.
What if you're not happy with what you hear?
Well, I think that following the report that has been received to the Policing Board and our Human Rights Advisor, that we need to discuss internally with the police, but with the Policing Board itself. But I have been open and honest, both with journalists in question and also with the wider public, that if it comes to using the Policing Board's powers of calling an inquiry, then I will be able to do that, and it's something that I am taking seriously. I will obviously continue engagement with journalists and also with Amnesty International, CAJ and the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, because this is a very serious issue. It's not only about accountability, but it's actually how can we ensure that this isn't happening now and going forward does not happen again.
Trevor Burney, what has been the personal cost to you?
Well, this case obviously has now become a very much part of our lives for myself and Barry McCaffrey. You know, it isn't just about turning up at a court, it is the process that is ongoing right from an hour ago that continued behind the scenes. We're dealing with legal advice, with the legal disclosure. I mean, I think it has come at a cost in terms of our faith in the journalists' relationship with the PSNI. I think when we as journalists at Paul, we do it all the time and have done it throughout our careers, and you call the PSNI press office, you treat them professionally, you treat them with courtesy, you give them the information, you expect a response. What we've learned so far in this process is our telephone numbers were being handed somewhere into a system in the PSNI that was running this defensive operation to try to find out who we were speaking to. So I think there's been an obsessive interest in journalists and their sources.
For what reason?
Well, that is the question. What is the reason? Why? Where did this come from? You know, we know that this goes right back to 2008, Paul. That's the first time we understand that Barry McCaffrey's data was harvested. But was Barry McCaffrey the first person in 2008? I doubt it. I think this goes way beyond that. And I think that's what the Policing Board and Nuala, and I'm sure all her colleagues there will want to know. When did this start? Why did it start? And what was the absolute purpose of it? Because I think it is a real challenge to the governance of Northern Ireland, really, that when you have a police force that can willy-nilly just decide to go, well, listen, let's look to see who Paul Clark's talking to. Well, let's look at these UT journalists or BBC journalists or Irish News journalists. I mean, that's an incredible abuse of power. Incredible abuse of power. And I think that's why this story is only getting bigger. And I think the cost to myself and Barry are, you know, the pressure that comes with there's legal costs, there's issues in terms of personal, just the attention we have to give it. But I think that we both understand how important this is for journalism, how important it is for not only for journalists but for lawyers and for activists and others. You know, we really do need to get to the bottom of this.
And to that extent, Patrick Corrigan, what are you hearing in the knowledge now that more journalists have most likely had their information harvested, and also solicitors?
Well, my phone has been hot since the revelations at the most recent hearing of the Investigatory Powers Tribunal from journalists, particularly those who work the crime and security beat, wanting to know, was I one of the people targeted by the police for my phone to be surveyed? And the answer is we don't actually know at the moment. So people, journalists, lawyers, NGO activists, other campaigners want to know, were they on the PSNI's spy list? And at the moment, our recommendation is lodge your complaints to the Investigatory Powers Tribunal. By all means, contact the police, contact the policing board. But we need to find out, because there are a lot of people worried out there. You know, a free press and a free independent legal system, they are cornerstones of any democratic society. And right now, people are concerned that those cornerstones have been severely undermined by the police here.
And one of those things, Paul, just to pick up on what Patrick's saying, I think it's important for clarity. We only know about this because Durham Police disclosed to us this through documents that they disclosed us just a few days before the last hearing. The PSNI did not disclose the court what it had been doing. It was its partner when it came to the arrest of myself and partner Barry McCaffrey in 2018. It was Durham that served the documents that disclosed to us this defensive operation. So I think that for Nuala, and I also think for the Ombudsman, those accountability mechanisms were put in place as a result of the Good Friday Agreement. We've got to ask at the culture at the PSNI that A, it's spying on journalists and activists and lawyers, that's what it's been doing, but also it's not been telling the truth to the policing board about what's been going on here. And it's quite clear with Pony that in the document that we were given, the PSNI are saying, well, we only tell the Ombudsman's office what we decide to give them, not what they should be giving to them. So I think this is a systemic cultural problem that I think Nuala and our colleagues will want to get to the bottom of.
And I think, Nuala, how shocked are you at what you're hearing here? Not just you alone, but other members of the policing board.
Well, we're shocked, firstly, around this whole spying of journalists and also the protection of sources, and that issue of how many and if any lawyers that were also spied on too. But to be perfectly honest, I was not shocked about the drip feed of information to the policing board. I have long called for greater transparency when it comes to information flowing at the request of the policing board. It has gotten better in recent times, but needs to strengthen. And if it does come to the policing board actually using full powers within their remit, then they must do so. But we also must recognise that the policing board may be limited and need to ensure that the relevant people who are looking into this, whether it is inquiry or not, have that security clearance in order to do that.
So what in the least can you or do you expect from the Chief Constable whenever he reports back?
Well, at the very least, I do expect in terms of, now we have to obviously recognise that there is this IPT ongoing tribunal, and we have to recognise that there is a process, but that does not mean that we cannot have the information that is required to get to the bottom of why these processes were actually set aside. I mean, we have police processes for a purpose. There are police powers here in Northern Ireland that need to be exercised in the correct way, and that's something that we need to get to the bottom of to ensure at what point and when these have been set aside, and the extent at which that has been done so, and what mechanisms have been put in place now or will be put in place to make sure that that is not happening and won't happen.
Patrick Corrigan, how do you see this being sorted? Because I suspect that this is a national issue dealt with by Westminster, but is there any input that the Assembly can have?
Well, I think Nuala's colleague, the Justice Minister, Naomi Long, I think has a role to play. I mean, I think now that public confidence has been so undermined by this spying scandal, I think she needs to step in and fulfil her role as well in restoring some of that confidence. I think one thing that she can certainly do to the policing board without undermining their independent role is to make clear that whatever funding is necessary for an inquiry that the board, we're calling for the board to set up, that funding will be available to run an inquiry, because of course there are costs involved. So I think that the Justice Minister can do that, and I think the Justice Committee should be having some oversight on this as well. But the next step is, come June, it's up to the policing board to fulfil their role under the Police Act 2000, and that is to establish an inquiry, because we have not had satisfaction to date in terms of full disclosure, full honesty and full openness by the Chief Constable by the Police Service in Northern Ireland, and I think that has to come to an end now. The policing board has that key responsibility to do, but they should be backed up by the Justice Minister.
Nuala McAllister, would you be leaning on your party leader, the Justice Minister, to come to your aid in this?
Well, I have just come out of the Assembly chamber earlier today in which the Justice Minister answered questions, and she made it quite clear that she would not rule anything out when it does come to actually assisting the policing board with this issue, because as she reiterated in the Assembly today, that being a journalist is not a crime and it should not be treated as such by the police.
How deep do you believe all of this must go, Trevor Burney?
It worries me, Paul. I mean, it really does, because, as I say, the PSNI have been brought to the IPT kicking and screaming. They have not released the documents in line with what the IPT had asked. When they give them deadlines, the PSNI never respect those deadlines, never give the information. It really only has become of Durham, because Durham have actually just decided to hand over everything that they found in their computers, and when they did, they even went back and checked again and found more. So I think that it has this whiff of scandal around it. There is something stinking in the middle of all of this, and I think that that's what we really need to get to, because I'm not sure the IPT can give all those journalists that are out there tonight worried about whether or not they were also subjected to this.
So what would satisfy you? What would satisfy you then?
I think that it's absolutely got to be an inquiry. There has to be a broad inquiry that looks at all the elements of this. The IPT are not going to be able to do that. The IPT are a very important court, an incredibly strong court with great powers, but it's not going to be able to answer the questions that other journalists and other NGOs and organisations have. So I do think that Naomi Long and the Policing Board do have to come together, and I do think it's only through the transparency of a full inquiry we're going to get to the bottom of this.
What effect does this have on the public and the way the public view the police?
Well, I think that the public are looking at it. I can only speak anecdotally in terms of what people are saying to me, but what they are saying to me is like, how did this happen? Where did this come from? And what exactly is going on at the PSNI? And I think that is raising questions. What Patrick's saying is it's really impacting on public confidence, I believe. And, after the Legacy Act and after everything that has happened in terms of are looking at the past, it seems to me like another element of that, where the PSNI have been concerned about security issues, have been looking at journalists, whose story, what are troublesome journalists, and what have those troublesome journalists been reporting on. I think that somehow will lead us into the mindset of the PSNI, how it's been treating, legacy inquests and inquiries here, but also then treating journalists on the other hand.
How likely is it that this goes way back into the days of the Troubles?
Well, I think it's quite likely, as Trevor's already said, it's unlikely that the first incident in the police deciding to snoop on journalists or lawyers was in 2007 or 2008. So how far back does it go, and how far into the present day does it go? I noticed the Irish News just a day or two ago published a story where the PSNI wouldn't confirm or deny whether or not those activities were still going on and targeted at journalists and lawyers. So we need to get the full truth about what has gone on, and we need to have clarity and confirmation that it will never, ever happen again.
A final question for you, Nuala. Do you believe that you will get full transparency from the Police Service of Northern Ireland?
Well, I do believe that I am going to fight for it for as long as it takes, and I'll be and have been with her, with Trevor and Barry. But this June meeting is the next step in seeing what the police are going to come forward with to the Policing Board. So I guess that's the real test there as to what exactly will happen next.
Nuala McAllister, Trevor Burney and Patrick Corrigan, thank you very much indeed.